Morgan's fingers trembled as she pressed record on her phone, the flight attendant's voice growing louder behind her. "I've worked this airline for 22 years and never seen such entitlement." The first-class cabin fell silent as passengers stared, some with disgust, others with shameful curiosity. Morgan had shown her boarding pass 3 times already. Her heart pounded as security approached. Then the flight attendant collapsed mid-sentence, clutching her chest, gasping, "She's not the one from the warrant." Morgan froze. Warrant? What warrant? Her prestigious law career suddenly hung by a thread. Before we begin this shocking story, let viewers know where you're watching from, and if you believe in the power of justice against discrimination, hit that like and subscribe button to stay updated on stories that matter. 20 minutes earlier, Morgan Wright had boarded Transcontinental Airways Flight 237 with a sense of purpose. Today's flight to Chicago would position her perfectly for tomorrow's career-defining presentation to Westlake Industries, potentially bringing a $100 million client to Ellis and Montgomery, where she was on track to become the firm's youngest senior partner. As a Harvard Law graduate with an impeccable win record, Morgan had rightfully earned her first-class seat through accumulated miles after years of business travel. She straightened her tailored navy suit as she located her window seat in 3A, tucking her designer briefcase under the seat in front of her. The flight attendant at the cabin entrance had smiled professionally, but Morgan hadn't missed the slight double-take when checking her boarding pass. It was subtle, but familiar. Morgan settled into her seat, mentally reviewing her presentation points when an older white couple paused in the aisle beside her. "Excuse me," the woman said with a tight smile. "I think you might be in our row." Morgan smiled politely and showed her boarding pass. "I'm in the correct seat, 3A. The woman's husband leaned forward, frowning. "This is first class, you know." Before Morgan could respond, another passenger intervened. "She's clearly in the right seat, just move along." Morgan nodded gratefully as the couple huffed away. This wasn't her first experience with assumptions, but she refused to let it disturb her focus on tomorrow's presentation. The real trouble began when Heather Caldwell started her pre-flight cabin check. The head flight attendant, a slim woman, in her 50s with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a tight smile, stopped abruptly at Morgan's row. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Heather's voice carried a sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. Morgan presented her digital pass on her phone. Heather studied it with unusual scrutiny, her lips pursing. "And may I see some ID as well?" Morgan provided her driver's license, maintaining her professional composure despite the fact that no other passengers were being subjected to this double verification. Heather compared the ID to Morgan's face for an uncomfortably long moment. "Thank you," she finally said, moving on. Morgan took a deep breath, trying to refocus on her presentation notes. Just another day navigating spaces not designed with her in mind. 10 minutes later, Heather returned. "I'm sorry to bother you again, but there seems to be some confusion about this seat assignment." Her voice was louder now, drawing attention from nearby passengers. "I've already verified my boarding pass twice," Morgan replied calmly, though her heart rate accelerated. "Is there a specific issue?" Heather's smile tightened. "Our system shows some inconsistency with your upgrade. First class is fully booked today." Morgan remained composed. "I used my miles for this upgrade 3 weeks ago and received confirmation. I'd be happy to show you the email." Several passengers were openly watching now, some with discomfort, others with barely concealed interest in the developing situation. A white businessman across the aisle caught Morgan's eye and gave a small nod of support. As Morgan pulled up her confirmation email, Heather's radio crackled. After listening to the message, her expression hardened. "Wait here," she instructed before walking briskly to the front of the cabin. Morgan noticed whispers spreading through first class. A young white woman diagonally across the aisle looked embarrassed and offered a sympathetic smile. The tension in Morgan's shoulders increased as Heather returned with another crew member. "Ms. Wright," Heather announced loudly, "we have reason to believe your upgrade was processed fraudulently." The accusation hung in the air as several passengers gasped. Morgan felt her cheeks burn despite her determination to remain professional. "That's absolutely false," she replied, keeping her voice steady. I've been a platinum member for 5 years and processed this upgrade through the official app. Heather crossed her arms. Our system flags certain unusual transactions, and yours has been flagged. I'll need you to gather your belongings and move to your originally assigned seat in economy. The second crew member stood awkwardly by, looking uncomfortable with the situation. I will not be moving, Morgan stated firmly. I have legitimate documentation of my seat assignment, which I've shown you twice now. If there's a system error, that's for your airline to address, not for me to be publicly humiliated. Her legal training kicked in as she maintained direct eye contact with Heather, whose face had begun to redden. Are you refusing a crew member's instruction? Heather demanded, voice rising. Because that's a federal offense. Morgan felt the weight of every eye in first class upon her. I'm refusing an unjustified instruction that singles me out without cause, she replied. I'd like to speak to the captain or your supervisor. Instead of responding, Heather pulled out her radio. Security to first class, seat 3A, passenger refusing compliance. The businessman who had nodded supportively earlier interjected, This is ridiculous. She's shown her documentation twice. Heather shot him a glare. Sir, please stay out of this. As security was summoned, Morgan made the quick decision to document what was happening, pulling out her phone and beginning to record just as Heather's accusations reached their peak. I've worked this airline for 22 years, Heather was practically shouting now, and I've never seen such entitlement. You cannot falsify documents and expect to get away with it. Morgan kept recording as she responded. I have falsified nothing. This is textbook discrimination, and I'm documenting it now. That's when Heather's expression shifted from anger to something else. A flash of panic crossed her features as she glanced at her tablet again. Security personnel appeared at the end of the aisle just as Heather suddenly clutched her chest, her face draining of color. Wait, she gasped, stumbling against the seat. She's not the one from the warrant. And then she collapsed into the aisle, leaving Morgan staring in shock at both the revelation and the medical emergency unfolding before her. What warrant? Morgan's mind raced as passengers jumped up in alarm and calls for a doctor echoed through the cabin. Her prestigious, law career, her carefully built reputation, everything suddenly hung by a thread with that single word, warrant. The next 30 minutes unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. Flight 237's departure was indefinitely delayed as medical personnel boarded to attend to Heather, who had regained consciousness but remained pale and disoriented on the aisle floor. Despite the flight attendant's collapse and her cryptic final words, the security officers who had been summoned didn't leave. Instead, they stood uncomfortably close to Morgan's seat, creating a visible spectacle for everyone on board. Ma'am, we'll need you to answer some questions, the taller officer said, his hand resting conspicuously on his radio. Morgan's legal instincts kicked in immediately. I'm happy to cooperate, but I'd like to understand what's happening. What warrant was Miss Caldwell referring to? The officer exchanged glances with his partner. That's what we're trying to determine, ma'am? Around them, the scene had transformed into a social media frenzy. At least a dozen passengers had their phones out, recording everything from multiple angles. Morgan could see herself reflected in their screens. A lone black woman surrounded by uniformed security in the first-class cabin. The optics couldn't have been worse. This is already getting thousands of views, whispered a teenager to her, mother in the row behind Morgan. First class while black is trending, someone else muttered. The airline's remaining flight attendants moved through the cabin with obvious discomfort, some avoiding eye contact with Morgan entirely, while others offered apologetic glances. A young male attendant named Ryan approached timidly. Ms. Wright, can I get you some water while this gets sorted out? Before Morgan could answer, an older female attendant pulled him aside, whispering something that made him retreat. The plane's intercom crackled to life, and the captain's voice filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. Our crew member is being treated and will be transported to a local hospital. In the meantime, we need to complete some security protocols before departure. A brief pause followed. Would the passenger in 3A please gather their belongings and proceed to the front of the aircraft for additional verification? Security will escort you. This is for the safety of all passengers." The announcement landed like a physical blow. Morgan felt her professional dignity stripped away with each word. Every eye in the cabin turned toward her, some curious, some judgmental, a few sympathetic. She had done nothing wrong, yet was being treated like a criminal. "I'll need your compliance, ma'am," the security officer said, motioning toward the aisle. "Would you have stood your ground or complied to avoid further conflict? Comment number 1 if you believe Morgan should refuse this humiliating treatment. Or number 2, if you think compliance was the safest option in this moment. Don't forget to like and subscribe to support stories that expose the reality of everyday discrimination." Morgan weighed her options quickly. Creating a larger scene would only feed the social media storm already brewing. With measured movements, she gathered her briefcase and phone, still recording. "I am complying under protest," she stated clearly for her recording. "I have committed no offense and have legitimate documentation for my seat." The walk of shame began. Row by row, Morgan moved through first class toward the exit, security officers flanking her closely. The whispers followed. What did she do? I knew something wasn't right when I saw her in first class. Poor thing, this seems wrong. Each step down the aisle felt longer than the last as she progressed through premium economy, then regular economy, hundreds of eyes tracking her movement. To the front, some passengers openly filmed her passage. Others pretended not to look but failed miserably. By the time she reached the aircraft door, Morgan's humiliation was complete, broadcast to the entire plane and, through social media, to the world beyond. The jetway wasn't the end of her ordeal. The terminal gate area was crowded with waiting passengers, airline staff, and now curious onlookers drawn by the commotion. Morgan emerged from the aircraft with her unwanted security escort to find at least 50 people watching, many with phones raised. Is that her? What happened? The questions hummed around her as she was directed to a small office off the main concourse. Inside, a harried-looking airline supervisor waited alongside 2 airport police officers. Ms. Wright, I'm Thomas Bentley, Customer Service Director, the supervisor began. We need to clarify a significant misunderstanding. Morgan placed her phone, still recording, on the table between them. I'd like that very much, she replied with forced calm, her legal training the only thing keeping her voice steady. The next 10 minutes revealed the horrifying truth. Security had confused Morgan Wright with a fugitive named Morgana Wright, wanted for fraud in 3 states. The airline's facial recognition system had flagged her as a potential match, despite numerous obvious differences. Morgana was 15 years younger, 4 inches shorter, and had distinctive tattoos. The only similarities were their race and similar names. This is unconscionable, Morgan said, her professional composure finally cracking. Your flight attendant publicly accused me of fraud, demanded I leave my rightfully purchased seat, called security on me, and created a spectacle. That's now viral online. All because your system can't distinguish between black women? Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Ms. Caldwell overreacted to the alert. We sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding. His emphasis on misunderstanding rather than discrimination wasn't lost on Morgan. We'd be happy to rebook you on the next flight to Chicago, upgrade included, of course, he offered with a tight smile that suggested he considered the matter resolved. Morgan glanced at her watch in dismay. Even if she took the next flight, she would miss her critical pre-meeting dinner with the partners. The presentation tomorrow morning was now in jeopardy. Your misunderstanding may have just cost my firm $100 million client, she said quietly. A rebooking doesn't begin to address the damage done here. The police officers, having verified Morgan's identity, looked increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. One of them, an older, black officer, gave her a subtle nod that spoke volumes. We'll need statements from everyone involved, he said to Thomas, including the flight attendant once she's medically cleared. Thomas nodded quickly. Of course, of course. Meanwhile, Ms. Wright, would you prefer the next flight or a complete refund? The casual way he offered these insufficient remedies for public humiliation and professional damage made Morgan's decision clear. This wouldn't end with a replacement ticket or refund. Someone needed to be held accountable for the systemic failures that had allowed racial profiling to masquerade as security protocol. But first, she needed to salvage what she could of her professional obligations. She reached for her phone to call her colleague Aiden. How could she explain that she'd been thrown off a flight because the airline couldn't tell black women apart? And would her career survive the viral video already circulating of her being escorted off the plane like a criminal? What other devastating consequences awaited her beyond this terminal? They did what? Aiden Matthews' voice carried through Morgan's phone with such volume that she had to pull it away from her ear. Standing in the terminal with her rebooked ticket for a flight departing in 3 hours, Morgan closed her eyes and massaged her temple with her free hand. I need you to stall the dinner meeting, Aiden. Tell them my flight was canceled due to mechanical issues. She deliberately kept her voice low, aware of the curious glances from nearby passengers who had witnessed her ordeal. Some were still filming discreetly. That's not going to work, Morgan, Aiden replied, his voice tense. Westlake's CEO just landed in Chicago an hour ago. The managing partners are already at the restaurant. Richard is fuming that you're not here to lead the presentation prep. Richard Ellis, the founding partner of Ellis and Montgomery, was not a man who accepted excuses, especially when a potential 9-figure client was involved. Morgan checked the time again. Even if everything went perfectly from this moment forward, she would miss the critical strategy dinner entirely and barely make tomorrow's presentation. Put me on speaker with Richard, Morgan decided. I'll explain the situation directly. The brief silence on the other end suggested Aiden's hesitation. He's not in a good place right now, Morgan. Let me try to smooth things over first. In the background, she could hear the upscale restaurant ambiance and muffled voices of the firm's senior partners. After an excruciating wait, Richard's clipped tones came through the line. Right. Where the hell are you? Westlake will be here in 20 minutes. Morgan took a deep breath. Sir, I've experienced a discriminatory incident with the airline. They removed me from the flight after racially profiling me and... Richard cut her off. Save it for your Instagram, counselor. We have a $100 million client walking through the door, and my senior associate pick for partner is missing in action. The coldness in his voice made it clear. He didn't believe. Her, or worse, didn't care. I'll be on the next flight, Morgan promised. I can still lead tomorrow's presentation. Richard's response was immediate and final. Aiden will handle it. When you finally decide to join us, we'll discuss your future with the firm. The call ended abruptly. Morgan stared at her phone in disbelief. 7 years of exceptional service to Ellis and Montgomery, countless all-nighters, record-breaking settlements, and Richard had just threatened her partnership track over a situation entirely beyond her control. Her phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had tagged her in a video post. With growing dread, she opened the link to find herself trending on 3 different social media platforms. The most viral video, already at 300,000 views and climbing, carried the headline, Black woman removed from first class after attendant collapses from stress. The comments section was a cesspool of speculation, many assuming she had somehow caused Heather's medical episode. Another notification popped up, a text from her mother. Honey, are you okay? Your cousin just called about a video of you online. The public humiliation was now reaching her family. Just as Morgan was about to respond to her mother, her phone rang with an unknown number. Ms. Wright, this is Trevor Richardson, Vice President of Customer Relations for Transcontinental Airways. The smooth, practiced voice oozed corporate damage control. I'm calling personally about the unfortunate misunderstanding on Flight 237 today. Morgan switched to speakerphone and began recording the call. Mr. Richardson, I wouldn't characterize racial profiling and public humiliation as a misunderstanding. There was a slight pause before Trevor continued, his tone unchanged. We take these matters very seriously, Ms. Wright. Transcontinental Airways has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. The rehearsed statement contrasted sharply with her lived experience just hours earlier. That's why I'd like to offer you our premier apology package, full refund of your flight, 10,000 bonus miles, and a voucher for future travel. Morgan nearly laughed at the absurdity. My professional reputation has been damaged, my partnership track potentially derailed, and you're offering me airline miles? Trevor's voice cooled slightly. We believe this is more than generous given the circumstances. Our internal review shows that proper security protocols were followed, even if there was a case of mistaken identity. Morgan's legal mind registered the careful phrasing. They were already positioning for potential litigation. Your proper security protocols resulted in my being publicly paraded through an aircraft and terminal based solely on racial profiling. Your system confused me with someone who doesn't even resemble me beyond our race. Trevor cleared his throat. Ms. Wright, I'd recommend accepting our offer. These situations can become complicated. Social media narratives are difficult to control, and we have access to all onboard recordings that tell the complete story. The implied threat wasn't subtle. Accept our token offer, or we'll make this worse for you. I'll have my attorney contact your legal department, Morgan replied, coolly. And Mr. Richardson? I recommend reviewing those recordings carefully before making threats. Discrimination cases can indeed become very complicated for airlines. She ended the call, her hands shaking with repressed anger. That evening, alone, in an airport hotel room instead of at the strategic dinner with Westlake Industries, Morgan received an email that confirmed her worst fears. The subject line read simply, "Temporary leave of absence." The firm's HR director had copied all managing partners on a message informing Morgan that, in light of recent events that may impact the firm's reputation, she was being placed on paid administrative leave pending an investigation of the incident. The email specifically mentioned concerning social media content and client relationships as factors in the decision. In less than 12 hours, Morgan had gone from rising star attorney on the verge of partnership to suspended employee under investigation. She opened her laptop to find dozens of emails from colleagues, some expressing genuine concern, others thinly veiling their ambition as they asked if they should step in on her cases during her difficult time. One message from a junior associate she had mentored simply read, "I'm so sorry this is happening to you. It's not right." Morgan stared out the hotel window at the airport runways, watching planes take off and land with mechanical precision. The system had worked exactly as designed today. Not the airline's security system, which had catastrophically failed, but the larger social system that ensured black excellence was always one misunderstanding away from derailment. As she contemplated her next steps, her phone buzzed with another notification. An email from an unfamiliar address contained only a screen capture of an internal airline document dated 3 weeks earlier. The highlighted section read, "Implement enhanced verification protocols for premium cabin upgrades on high-value routes. Special attention to unusual booking patterns and demographic anomalies." The sender's name was simply a friend at TA. Morgan sat up straight, her legal mind suddenly alert. This wasn't just about one prejudiced flight attendant or a faulty facial recognition system. There was a pattern here, a policy, and someone on the inside knew it. She saved the document, created 3 backup copies, and began taking detailed notes of everything that had happened. If Transcontinental Airways thought she would quietly accept miles and move on, they had profiled the wrong attorney. The next morning, Morgan woke to her phone vibrating continuously with notifications. Overnight, the video of her removal from the aircraft had exploded across the internet, accumulating millions of views and thousands of comments. Major news outlets had picked up the story, with headlines ranging from sympathetic, "Black attorney racially profiled on flight," to accusatory, "Disruptive passenger causes medical emergency for flight attendant." Morgan scrolled through her emails, finding dozens from journalists seeking comment. Her firm had sent another terse message reinforcing her administrative leave and explicitly instructing her not to speak to media on any matters that might reflect on Ellis and Montgomery. She was effectively being silenced while her reputation burned. With her professional obligations temporarily suspended, Morgan channeled her legal training into researching Transcontinental Airways history with minority passengers. What she discovered was disturbing. Over the past 5 years, there had been 47 reported incidents of black first-class passengers being questioned about their seating assignments, compared to only 3 such incidents involving white passengers. In 12 cases, passengers had been asked to move despite having valid tickets. The airline had settled 4 discrimination lawsuits quietly, with sealed agreements. Most tellingly, complaints about racial profiling had increased 300% since Transcontinental had implemented its new security verification system 18 months ago. The pattern was impossible to ignore, yet somehow the airline had avoided significant public scrutiny. Morgan was comparing demographic data when her phone rang with another unknown number. "Ms. Wright, this is Vanessa Chen from the National Herald. I'm an investigative journalist covering corporate accountability and discrimination." Morgan hesitated, mindful of her firm's warning against media engagement. "I'm not sure I can comment, Ms. Chen." The journalist continued undeterred. "I understand, but I'm not just calling about your incident. I've been investigating Transcontinental Airways for months. Your case fits a pattern I've documented." Morgan's interest was immediately piqued. "What kind of pattern?" Vanessa's voice lowered slightly. "Systematic targeting of minorities in premium cabins, especially on high-profit routes. I've interviewed 17 passengers with experiences similar to yours in the past year alone. Your case is just the first to go viral." The confirmation that her experience wasn't isolated strengthened Morgan's resolve. "I'd like to hear more, but not over the phone. Can we meet?" 3 hours later, Morgan sat across from Vanessa Chen in a quiet corner of a downtown coffee shop. The journalist, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s, spread several documents across the table. "These are incident reports filed by passengers, internal emails I've obtained from sources, and statistical analyses of passenger complaints by race and cabin class." Morgan's legal eye quickly recognized the significance of what she was seeing. One email from a regional director to flight crews stated, "Remember our premium cabin standardization policy. Inconsistencies with passenger profile expectations should be verified thoroughly." The corporate doublespeak barely masked the underlying directive. "Question passengers who don't fit the profile of first-class travelers." "How did you get these?" Morgan asked, impressed by the journalist's collection. "I have sources inside the airline who are uncomfortable with these policies," Vanessa replied, "including information about your specific incident." Vanessa pulled out another document, this one showing a passenger manifest for Flight 237. Morgan's name was highlighted in yellow with a notation, FRP, Further Review Protocol. "What's FRP?" Morgan asked. Vanessa's expression darkened. "It's their internal flag for passengers who warrant additional scrutiny. Officially, it's based on security algorithms. In practice, my sources say it disproportionately flags minorities, especially in premium cabins." She pushed another paper forward, a statistical breakdown showing that black passengers were 15 times more likely to receive an FRP designation than white passengers with identical booking patterns. "But here's what's especially interesting about your case," Vanessa continued. "You were specifically added to the FRP list after filing a complaint about service on a previous transcontinental flight last month." Morgan remembered the complaint, a minor issue with in-flight entertainment that she had reported through the airline's feedback form. "Are you saying I was targeted because I complained?" Before Vanessa could answer, Morgan's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Check your email. More evidence. Be careful who you trust." She opened her email to find a forwarded internal airline memo with the subject line, "Passenger Profiling Initiative, Phase 2 Results." The memo detailed success metrics in maintaining premium cabin atmosphere through enhanced verification procedures, and included statistics on passenger redistribution by race. The sender had added only one line of text. "They're watching. You now. Meeting was bugged. Former TA employee." Morgan looked up sharply, scanning the coffee shop. 2 tables away, a man in a business suit seemed unusually interested in his newspaper, while positioned with a clear view of their table. "We need to leave," Morgan whispered to Vanessa. "Now." Outside, walking briskly down the street, Morgan shared the forwarded email with Vanessa. "This is exactly what I've been working to prove," the journalist said, her voice tense with excitement and concern. "But my investigation goes deeper than passenger profiling. I believe there's a connection between transcontinental airways policies and certain corporate clients who've pressured the airline to maintain a particular passenger experience in premium cabins." Morgan stopped walking. "Corporate clients like Westlake Industries?" she asked, a sickening realization forming. Vanessa looked surprised. "How did you know?" "Westlake is one of Transcontinental's biggest corporate accounts. They have a special contract guaranteeing their executives premium travel experience standards." The pieces suddenly connected in Morgan's mind. Her law firm's biggest potential new client was directly linked to the airline's discriminatory practices. And not just linked, potentially driving them. Morgan shared her suspicion about the connection between Westlake, her law firm, and the airline. "I need to find out if my firm knew about these practices," she said, her voice hardening with determination. "If they were willing to sacrifice me to protect a discriminatory client relationship." Vanessa nodded. "Be careful. These connections run deep. Corporate executives, board members, they move between these companies, sit on each other's boards, protect each other's interests." As if to confirm her warning, Morgan's phone alerted her to a breaking news notification. Transcontinental Airways CEO James Whitfield issues statement on viral flight incident. The accompanying photo showed Whitfield at a podium and standing. Just behind him was a face Morgan recognized immediately, Richard Ellis, her firm's managing partner. "They're not just connected," Morgan whispered, showing Vanessa the image. "They're coordinating their response." The journalist's eyes widened. "This goes higher than I thought." Morgan's mind raced with implications. Her own law firm, the institution she had devoted her career to, appeared to be actively involved in covering up discriminatory practices that had targeted her personally. The betrayal cut deep, but it also steeled her resolve. "I need to get back into my office," she decided. "There will be evidence there of how long they've known about this." But returning to Ellis and Montgomery would mean walking straight into the den of those who had abandoned her, and who now knew she was a threat to their relationship with Whitfield and Transcontinental Airways. What other secrets might she uncover within her own firm's files? And how far would they go to protect those secrets from exposure? Morgan arrived at the Ellis and Montgomery building the following morning with a carefully crafted strategy. Despite being on administrative leave, her key card still worked, an oversight she intended to exploit before anyone realized their mistake. The early hour, barely 7 a.m., meant the offices would be largely empty. She needed access to internal communications about Westlake Industries and Transcontinental Airways, evidence that might reveal how deeply her firm was involved in covering up discriminatory practices. Her heart pounded as she swiped her card and entered the sleek lobby. "Ms. Wright." The security guard nodded, seemingly unaware of her changed status. "Early start today." Morgan forced a casual smile. "Big case preparation," she replied, hurrying toward the elevators. The familiar ping of the elevator reaching the 32nd floor normally brought Morgan a sense of accomplishment. The prestigious address and sweeping city views were tangible markers of her career success. Today, however, the quiet hallways felt hostile, hiding secrets that had upended her life. She moved quickly to her corner office, grateful to find it still intact. As she logged into her computer, a notification popped up. "System administrator requires additional verification. Please contact IT." They hadn't completely locked her out yet, but they were monitoring. She had limited time. Rather than alerting IT, Morgan connected a small external drive Vanessa had provided, loaded with specialized software to copy email archives without triggering security alerts. She needed documentation of any communications regarding Transcontinental's passenger policies or her specific flight. Have you ever discovered that people you trusted were working against you all along? Comment number 1, if you've experienced workplace betrayal, or number 2, if you've been lucky enough to avoid such backstabbing. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of resilience against systemic injustice. 20 minutes into her search, Morgan heard voices in the hallway. She quickly minimized her screens as a light knock sounded at her door. "Morgan, what are you doing here?" It was Lawrence Kim, a fellow senior associate and occasional ally on difficult cases. His expression showed genuine confusion. "I thought you were on leave." Morgan maintained her composure. "Just collecting some personal items," she lied smoothly. "I didn't expect anyone in so early." Lawrence hesitated in the doorway. "Everyone's talking about what happened. The video is everywhere." His voice lowered. "The partners had an emergency meeting last night about it." Morgan's pulse quickened. "Do you know what was discussed?" Lawrence glanced nervously down the hallway before stepping inside and closing the door. Richard was furious, not about how you were treated, but about the timing with Westlake. Then Edward Ellis joined by video call and things got intense. Edward Ellis, the firm's founding partner and Richard's father, rarely involved himself in day-to-day operations anymore. His intervention signaled the severity of the situation. "What did Edward say?" Morgan pressed. Lawrence shifted uncomfortably. "That's the strange part. He seemed more concerned about Transcontinental Airways than about Westlake or you. He mentioned something about significant investment exposure and board responsibilities before they kicked all associates out of the meeting." Morgan processed this new information. Edward Ellis was on Transcontinental's board? That would explain the firm's rapid abandonment of her. "Morgan," Lawrence continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "there's something else. They've already reassigned all your cases. Richard told us the decision came from Edward directly. The speed of their action was telling. This wasn't standard administrative leave protocol. They were erasing her professionally before she could become a liability." "I need to check something," Morgan said, turning back to her computer. "Can you keep watch?" Lawrence nodded, though uncertainty clouded his features. Morgan quickly searched the firm's client database for Transcontinental Airways. The results stunned her. Ellis and Montgomery had represented the airline in settling all 4 previous discrimination lawsuits she had discovered in her research. The same partners now courting Westlake had quietly helped Transcontinental bury evidence of racial profiling for years. A separate search revealed that Edward Ellis personally owned over $5 million in Transcontinental stock. The conflict of interest was staggering. Her own firm had every motivation to discredit her experience rather than support her. As she downloaded these records to her drive, Lawrence reappeared at the door. "Richard just arrived," he warned. "And he's asking why your keycard was used this morning." Morgan quickly disconnected the drive and slipped it into her pocket. "Thanks for the heads up," she said, gathering her purse. "Lawrence, did you know about the firm's relationship with South Transcontinental?" His averted gaze answered before his words did. "Not until yesterday, I'm sorry, Morgan." She was barely out of her office when she spotted Richard Ellis striding purposefully down the hallway, his face set in grim determination. "Right," he called sharply. "My office, now." Several early arriving associates pretended not to notice the confrontation as Morgan followed Richard into his corner suite. He closed the door with controlled precision before turning to face her. "Explain to me why you're accessing our servers while on administrative leave." His tone was ice cold. Morgan maintained professional composure. "I came to collect personal items and research for cases I've been managing for years. Cases that apparently have been reassigned without any consultation." Richard's expression didn't change. "Your access to firm resources is suspended during this investigation. I'll need your keycard and any firm devices immediately." Morgan handed over her card, but remained silent about the external drive in her pocket. "I think we both know this isn't about the airline incident," she said calmly. "It's about Edward's position on Transcontinental's board and the firm's history of helping them settle discrimination cases." The slight widening of Richard's eyes confirmed she had struck a nerve. "You're constructing conspiracy theories to avoid responsibility for your own actions," he replied, but the practiced ease of his usually smooth delivery was missing. "Your behavior on that flight and subsequent media campaign have damaged this firm's reputation and jeopardized client relationships." Morgan didn't flinch. "My behavior? I was racially profiled, publicly humiliated, and removed from a flight for which I had valid documentation. The only thing I'm guilty of is being a black woman in first class." Richard's jaw tightened. That's your interpretation. The airline has provided us with a very different account. Of course they had. The coordination between Transcontinental and Ellis and Montgomery was clearly well established. I'm sure they did, Morgan replied. Just as I'm sure you helped them craft it. She moved toward the door. I'll have my personal belongings collected later this week. Richard's voice stopped her. You should know that your office is being relocated while you're on leave. We needed your space for the Westlake team. The petty power move was meant to emphasize her sudden expendability. Where exactly is my new office? Morgan asked, already suspecting the answer. Richard's thin smile confirmed it. We've prepared a workspace in the file room on the basement level, temporarily, of course. The message couldn't be clearer. She was being buried, literally and figuratively. How considerate, Morgan replied with equal insincerity. And my case files? Richard waved dismissively. All reassigned appropriately. Austin has taken over your major clients. Austin Reed, her most ambitious and least principled colleague, would certainly work to ensure those clients never returned to her, even if she survived this professional assassination. As Morgan left Richard's office, she noticed the stares and whispers from colleagues who had once sought her mentorship. Some averted their eyes entirely. Others watched with barely concealed curiosity or schadenfreude. By the time she reached the elevator, she had received an email notification that her firm email access had been revoked and her personal belongings would be inventoried and delivered to her home address. They were locking her out completely, ensuring she couldn't access any further damaging information. In the elevator, alone for a moment, Morgan checked her phone to find text messages from 3 clients asking why they had been reassigned to other attorneys without consultation. The professional damage was spreading rapidly, exactly as the firm intended. Before leaving the building, Morgan made one final stop. The IT department was located on the 30th floor, and she had one potential ally there. Dev Patel had helped her recover critical evidence files numerous times over the years, often working late to meet her trial deadlines. His cubicle was tucked in the back corner, intentionally isolated from management oversight. Dev, she called, softly from the department entrance. He looked up, surprise and then concern crossing his features. Morgan, I heard what happened. That's seriously messed up. She approached his desk, lowering her voice. I need to know something. Has anyone requested access to monitor my personal devices or accounts? Dev glanced around nervously before typing something on his keyboard. He turned the screen slightly toward her. The message read, Yes, full surveillance package initiated yesterday. Office bugged this morning. Be careful. Morgan maintained a neutral expression while processing this alarming information. Thanks for checking, she said at normal volume. If you find my missing trial notes, let me know. Dev nodded, understanding the coded conversation. As she turned to leave, he slipped a small device into her hand, a signal detector to identify surveillance equipment. Back at her apartment that evening, Morgan used Dev's device to discover 3 newly planted listening devices, one near her home office desk, another by her dining table, and a third by her bedside. The invasion of her private space was shocking, but not entirely surprising, given what she now knew about the connections between her firm, Transcontinental Airways, and Westlake Industries. They were monitoring her every move, every conversation, every strategy she might develop to defend herself. As she silently removed the bugs and flushed them down the toilet, a new text arrived from an unknown number. Check inside your laptop cooling fan. GPS tracker installed during inventory of your office today. The surveillance was even more extensive than she had imagined. Who had placed that warning text? How many people within Ellis and Montgomery were uncomfortable with the firm's actions, but too afraid to openly ally with her? And more importantly, how would she fight back against this coordinated attack on her career and reputation when her opponents controlled nearly every resource and relationship she had built over the past 7 years? Morgan awoke the next morning to the sound of a car engine idling outside her apartment building. Peering through the blinds, she spotted a black sedan with tinted windows parked directly across the street, positioned with a clear view of her front door. The vehicle had no distinguishing features beyond a small antenna on the trunk, typical of surveillance operations. This was no longer just professional retaliation. They were monitoring her physical movements. As she moved away, from the window, her phone chimed with multiple notifications. Overnight, her social media accounts had been flooded with hostile comments from strangers. Entitled fraud causing hard-working flight attendants to collapse, playing the race card to get special treatment, another lawyer looking for a payday. The coordinated nature of the attack was obvious. Hundreds of similar messages had appeared within the same 2-hour window, many using identical phrasing. Morgan documented the harassment before locking down her privacy settings, then checked her email to find equally disturbing developments. Overnight, her professional biography had been removed from the Ellis and Montgomery website. A legal blog had published an insider account claiming she had a history of manufacturing discrimination claims, a complete fabrication that nonetheless appeared prominently in search results for her name. Most alarmingly, she had received notification that the Bar Association had received an ethics complaint regarding her conduct on Flight 237, and subsequent defamatory statements against Transcontinental Airways. The complaint was anonymous but used legal language that suggested an experienced attorney had drafted it. The coordinated attack on her professional reputation was expanding beyond social media into the formal structures that governed her career. As Morgan prepared coffee, trying to process these developments, her phone rang. "Morgan? It's your mother. Are you okay, sweetheart?" The concern in Elaine Wright's voice was evident even through the phone connection. "I'm handling it, Mom," Morgan replied, not wanting to worry her 68-year-old mother who had already survived enough stress raising a black daughter alone in a predominantly white suburb. "It's just a misunderstanding with the airline." Her mother's silence indicated she wasn't convinced. "That's not what the man who called me said," Elaine finally responded, her voice tight with worry. Morgan's hand froze around her coffee mug. "What man? Someone called you?" Her mother explained that late the previous night, a man claiming to be from airline security had called asking questions about Morgan's history of confrontational behavior, and suggesting that Elaine might want to encourage her daughter to accept the airline's generous settlement before things escalate further. The thinly veiled threat to her elderly mother sent a wave of rage through Morgan that momentarily displaced her fear. "Mom, listen carefully," Morgan instructed, her attorney instincts kicking in. "If anyone calls again, don't engage. Tell them, all communications must go through my attorney and hang up. Then call me immediately. Can you do that?" After reassuring her mother and ensuring she had support from neighbors, Morgan ended the call, her hands shaking with anger. They had crossed a line by involving her family. She needed to act decisively before the situation escalated further. Just as she reached for her laptop, her phone chimed with a text from her neighbor across the hall. "Someone was trying your door this morning around 4 a.m. I looked through the peephole and saw a man in a dark jacket. He left when I turned on my lights." Morgan immediately checked her security camera footage, but discovered the system had been disabled during the night. The app showed connection error for the critical time period. The mounting evidence of surveillance and intimidation convinced Morgan she needed professional help. She called Xavier Thompson, a prominent civil rights attorney she had met at a legal conference years earlier. "Xavier, I'm dealing with a coordinated attack following a racial profiling incident," she explained after reaching him. "It involves a major airline, my own law firm, and potentially other corporate entities." Xavier listened intently before responding. "This is how they operate, Morgan. Discredit the victim while controlling the narrative. I've seen it before, with Transcontinental." His familiarity with the airline's tactics confirmed she had called the right person. "Come to my office today. Use a rideshare under a different name, and leave your phone at home. They're almost certainly tracking it." The precautions might have seemed paranoid just days earlier. Now they felt necessary. Following Xavier's instructions, Morgan left her phone in her apartment's bathroom with the shower running to create a digital alibi, then exited through the building's service entrance. She took a circuitous route to Xavier's office in the city's legal district, where his receptionist immediately escorted her to a conference room with signal-blocking technology. We call this the Faraday cage, Xavier explained as he entered. No electronic surveillance can penetrate these walls. For the next 2 hours, Morgan detailed everything that had happened since the flight incident, including the connections she had uncovered between her firm, Transcontinental Airways, and Westlake Industries. Xavier took careful notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When she finished, he sat back with a grim expression. They're following the corporate discrimination playbook to the letter. Discredit, isolate, intimidate, then offer a lowball settlement when you're at your most vulnerable. I won't settle, Morgan stated firmly. Too many people have experienced this same treatment and been silenced. Xavier nodded approvingly. Good. But you should know what you're up against. These corporations have virtually unlimited resources and powerful connections. They'll dig through every aspect of your life looking for anything they can use against you. Credit history, dating life, college indiscretions, nothing is off limits. As if on cue, Morgan's temporary phone rang with a call from her bank. Her accounts had been frozen due to suspicious activity. When she demanded details, the representative explained that multiple large transfers had been attempted from her accounts overnight, triggering their fraud detection system. I didn't authorize any transfers, Morgan insisted. The representative's response was chilling. The attempts came from your home IP address, Ms. Wright, using your correct security questions. Someone had thoroughly compromised her financial identity. Back at Xavier's office, they were discussing options when his assistant interrupted with an urgent message. Someone claiming to be Detective Marcus Jackson from the Financial Crimes Unit is in the lobby asking for Ms. Wright. Xavier and Morgan exchanged concerned glances. I didn't contact any detective, she confirmed. Xavier instructed his assistant to verify the detective's credentials and escort him to a different conference room. I'll meet with him first, he decided. This could be legitimate given the financial intrusions, or it could be another intimidation tactic. While Xavier was gone, Morgan used his secure computer to check her email. Among the usual spam and notifications was a message from an encrypted address with the subject line, "Not all of us agree with what they're doing to you." The brief message read, I'm a flight attendant with TA. I was on your flight and saw everything. Heather was lying. I have proof. Meet tomorrow, 3 p.m. Central Park Cafe. I'll wear a blue scarf. Sophia. Xavier returned 30 minutes later with a tall, middle-aged black man in a well-worn suit. Ms. Wright, I'm Detective Marcus Jackson, from the Financial Crimes Division. Your accounts weren't the only target last night. We've identified a pattern of attacks against prominent black professionals across 3 states. The detective's credentials appeared legitimate, and his manner was professional rather than intimidating. He explained that her case connected to a larger investigation into identity theft, rings potentially working for corporate interests. We've seen this before. Discriminatory incident goes viral, then victims' finances and reputation get systematically attacked. Makes it harder for them to fight back. Detective Jackson seemed genuinely concerned, offering to assign extra patrols near her apartment and providing his direct number for emergencies. As he was leaving, he paused at the door. Off the record, Ms. Wright. I've been flying transcontinental for 15 years. Started getting randomly selected for additional screening every single time after I made diamond status. This isn't just about one flight attendant or one incident. It's systemic. That evening, returning to her apartment after implementing financial safeguards, Morgan found her mother waiting outside her building. I couldn't stay away knowing you're going through this alone, Elaine explained, pulling her daughter into a tight embrace. They called again, asking more questions. Morgan's concern deepened. The harassment was escalating despite her precautions. After settling her mother in the guest room, Morgan checked her secure email to find a disturbing update from Vanessa Chen. 2 sources went silent overnight. Third source says someone accessed their home. Be careful, they're eliminating witnesses. The walls were closing in as Transcontinental and her former firm systematically dismantled her support network and applied pressure from multiple directions. Even Detective Jackson had noted the pattern from previous cases. Isolate the victim, destroy their credibility, drain their resources, then offer settlement when they're too exhausted to continue fighting. As Morgan sat in her darkened living Room that night, watching the same black sedan still parked across the street, her temporary phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. Your mother's medication has been processed at Wilson Pharmacy. Refills available for pickup tomorrow. The message was clearly meant to convey that they knew intimate details about her mother's health, a threat wrapped in mundane information. They were escalating again, demonstrating their reach into her most personal concerns. Morgan took a deep breath, fighting the rising tide of anxiety. Tomorrow she would meet Sophia, the flight attendant who claimed to have evidence. If legitimate, this could be the breakthrough she needed to shift momentum in her favor. But the meeting also carried significant risk. What if it was a trap? What if Sophia had been coerced or replaced? The stakes were rising with each passing day, and Morgan increasingly felt that her opponents were always several steps ahead, anticipating her moves before she made them. Who could she truly trust in this expanding web of surveillance and intimidation? And how far would Transcontinental Airways and Ellis and Montgomery go to silence her? Morgan arrived at Central Park Cafe 30 minutes early, carefully scanning the area for surveillance or potential threats. She had taken extensive precautions for this meeting, leaving her phone at Xavier's office, using public transportation, with multiple transfers, and wearing a nondescript baseball cap and sunglasses. Finding a table with a clear view of both entrances, she ordered a coffee and waited, anxiety building with each passing minute. At precisely 3 o'clock, a slender, white woman with a bright blue scarf wrapped around her neck entered the cafe. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with nervous eyes that darted around the space before settling on Morgan. After ordering at the counter, she approached cautiously. "Ms. Wright?" she asked in a hushed voice. Morgan nodded slightly, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Sophia, I presume?" Once seated, Sophia kept her voice low. "I don't have much time. They're monitoring crew social media and communications since your video went viral." She reached into her purse and slid a small USB drive across the table. "This contains the unedited cabin footage from your flight. The airline has exterior cameras, galleys, and main cabin surveillance that passengers don't know about." Morgan's eyebrows raised in surprise. "Isn't releasing this a violation of company policy?" Sophia smiled grimly. "Definitely. Firing offense, at minimum, possibly worse given what's on it." She took a sip of her coffee, hands trembling slightly. "But what happened to you was wrong. And it's not isolated. Many of us have been uncomfortable with the passenger profile verification process they implemented last year. The confirmation from an insider validated everything Morgan had suspected. The footage shows Heather deliberately targeting you." Sophia nodded. "That and more. It shows her receiving specific instructions through her earpiece about you before she even approached your seat." "And her collapse?" Sophia leaned closer. "It was theatrics. She's done it before when confrontations with certain passengers start, getting recorded, creates sympathy, shifts the narrative." This revelation aligned with what Morgan had suspected upon discovering Heather's medical records had been falsified. "Why are you helping me?" Morgan asked directly. "You're risking your career." Sophia's expression hardened. "My grandmother was one of the first black flight attendants in the 60s. The stories she told me." She shook her head. "I became a flight attendant to continue her legacy of making the skies welcoming for everyone. What Transcontinental is doing dishonors everything she fought for." Before Morgan could respond, Sophia stiffened, her eyes fixed on something over Morgan's shoulder. "Don't turn around. Man at the counter has been photographing us. I need to go." She stood quickly. "There are others who feel the same way I do. You're not alone." With that cryptic parting message, Sophia hurried out the side exit. Morgan waited several minutes before leaving through a different door, the USB drive securely hidden in her boot. Back at Xavier's office, they reviewed the footage together on an isolated computer. The unedited surveillance video confirmed everything Sophia had claimed. Heather receiving specific instructions about Morgan, the deliberate multiple checks of her documentation, and most damning of all, the moment before her collapse, where she could be seen preparing for the performance, checking that cameras were on her. "This is gold," Xavier said, copying the files to multiple secure locations. But we need more than one whistleblower. Transcontinental will claim this is manipulated footage and destroy Sophia's credibility if she's the only source. Morgan agreed, frustration evident in her voice. Every time we gain ground, they seem to have contingencies in place. Xavier suddenly smiled. Then let's change the battlefield. Stop playing defense. He outlined a bold strategy. Rather than responding to each attack individually, they would build a coalition of affected passengers, industry whistleblowers, and civil rights organizations to create collective pressure. One voice they can silence. Dozens united? Much harder. Over the next 3 days, working from Xavier's secured office, Morgan helped establish connections with other victims of Transcontinental's discriminatory practices. Through Vanessa Chen's journalism contacts and social media outreach, they identified 23 minority passengers who had experienced similar profiling in first-class cabins. Each story followed a disturbingly similar pattern: arbitrary questioning of documentation, accusations of fraud, public humiliation, and subsequent reputation attacks if they complained. Benjamin Kim, a cybersecurity expert and former client of Xavier's, volunteered to help secure their communications and digital evidence. They're using sophisticated methods to monitor and discredit you, he explained during a strategy session. Corporate-level surveillance tools, professional reputation management algorithms, possibly even access to restricted financial systems. His team established encrypted channels for the growing coalition to share experiences and evidence safely, beyond the reach of Transcontinental's monitoring. Meanwhile, Xavier leveraged his connections with the National Civil Liberties Alliance to begin preparing a potential class action lawsuit, gathering affidavits and documentation from each affected passenger. The individual stories were powerful, but collectively, they revealed an undeniable pattern of systemic discrimination. Morgan's former law professor, Eleanor Washington, offered her expertise in corporate accountability law. "What Transcontinental and your firm did crosses every ethical boundary," she stated after reviewing the evidence. "The Bar Association needs to know that Ellis and Montgomery was representing both sides of discrimination settlements without disclosure." Her outrage translated into practical assistance, connecting Morgan with former students now working in regulatory agencies who could help navigate the complex intersections of aviation law, civil rights statutes, and corporate governance. With each new ally, Morgan felt the balance of power shifting slightly in her favor. The isolation tactics were failing as a supportive network formed around her case. The coalition's efforts gained momentum when Sophia convinced 2 other Transcontinental flight attendants to provide statements about the airline's passenger verification protocols. Both confirmed receiving specific training on identifying upgrade anomalies, a euphemism for questioning minorities in premium cabins. One provided internal training materials explicitly instructing crew to ensure passenger demographics align with cabin expectations. Most significantly, a retired Transcontinental executive reached out through Xavier's secure channels, offering testimony about how the airline had intentionally designed its algorithms to flag certain passenger demographic patterns for additional scrutiny. The evidence was mounting piece by piece into an irrefutable case of systematic discrimination. As media interest in the story grew beyond the initial viral video, Morgan carefully coordinated with Vanessa Chen to ensure accurate reporting. Rather than focusing solely on her individual experience, they emphasized the pattern affecting dozens of passengers and the corporate policies enabling discrimination. Several major news outlets picked up the expanded story, framing it as a test case for algorithmic bias and corporate accountability. The public narrative was shifting from an isolated incident between one passenger and one flight attendant to a systemic failure of corporate ethics across multiple companies. Support messages flooded in from across the country, with "Justice for Morgan" and "First Class While Black" trending across social platforms. Detective Jackson proved to be an unexpected ally, providing updates on his financial crimes investigation that increasingly pointed to coordinated attacks against discrimination claimants. "We've traced the intrusion attempts on your accounts to a reputation management firm with connections to several major airlines," he informed Morgan during a secure meeting. "They operate in legal gray areas, technically not breaking laws, but pushing every ethical boundary. Though he couldn't officially share law enforcement information, his discreet guidance helped Morgan's team anticipate and counter several planned attacks on coalition members. The detectives' involvement suggested that at least some elements of law enforcement recognized the injustice at play. 7 days after the initial flight incident, the coalition had grown to include 47 affected passengers, 6 current and former airline employees, 3 civil rights organizations, and a team of specialized attorneys working pro bono. Xavier called an emergency strategy meeting when Benjamin discovered something alarming during his security sweeps. "They've escalated their surveillance," the cybersecurity expert explained, displaying technical data on a secure tablet. "These patterns suggest they're using government-grade monitoring tools now, normally restricted to law enforcement or intelligence agencies." The implication was clear. Someone with significant influence had directed extraordinary resources toward monitoring their activities. "They're getting desperate," Xavier observed, "which means we're making progress." As the meeting concluded, Morgan received a secure message from Sophia. "Urgent. Just overheard TAVP Trevor Richardson in Crew Lounge, recording attached." The audio file captured Trevor speaking to someone about the Morgan Wright situation, in explicitly racist terms. "These people never know their place. First class has standards for a reason. We've got too many of them thinking they belong there now." The unguarded comments, clearly not intended for public consumption, revealed the true attitudes driving Transcontinental's policies. The recording ended with Trevor's most damning statement: "Don't worry, we've handled troublemakers before. By next week, she'll be begging to settle for whatever we offer." The naked racism and explicit threat provided exactly the evidence they needed to demonstrate that discrimination wasn't an accident, but a deliberate strategy. As Morgan shared the recording with the coalition team, a sense of cautious optimism filled the room. For the first time since the incident, they had caught Transcontinental's leadership explicitly revealing their true intentions. The question now was how best to leverage this breakthrough before the airline could mount its inevitable counterattack. The following morning, Morgan woke to an urgent call from Xavier. "They've gone nuclear," he said without preamble. "Transcontinental filed a defamation lawsuit against you at 8:01 a.m., 10 million in damages for false claims of discrimination, causing reputational harm and lost business." Morgan had anticipated legal action, but the speed and scale of the lawsuit was clearly designed to overwhelm her resources. "They're also seeking an emergency injunction to prevent you or any coalition members from speaking publicly about the airline while litigation is pending." The timing was strategic. A Friday filing meant the earliest they could respond would be Monday, giving Transcontinental an entire weekend to control the narrative unopposed. "It gets worse," Xavier continued. "They've named me, Vanessa, and 12 other coalition members as co-defendants. They're trying to fracture our alliance by threatening everyone simultaneously. Has a powerful company or person ever tried to silence you when you stood up for the truth? Comment number 1. If you believe corporations should be held accountable for discriminatory practices, or number 2, if you think Morgan should just accept the settlement and move on with her life. Like and subscribe to follow this shocking story of corporate retaliation against those who dare speak up. Within hours, the corporate counterattack expanded beyond legal channels. Major news outlets that had previously covered Morgan's story now featured interviews with aviation experts and security consultants questioning her account. The carefully crafted media blitz introduced subtle seeds of doubt. While discrimination is always concerning, questions have been raised about the accuracy of Ms. Wright's allegations. A business news channel ran a special segment titled "The High Cost of False Discrimination Claims," featuring commentary from several executives including, not surprisingly, James Whitfield, Transcontinental's CEO. Without naming Morgan directly, Whitfield lamented how social media enables isolated incidents to be misrepresented for financial gain, damaging companies that have worked diligently on diversity initiatives. The coordinated messaging strategy was clear: reframe Morgan as an opportunist exploiting a minor misunderstanding. Simultaneously, coalition members began reporting disturbing developments. 2 passengers who had shared their discrimination experiences publicly received letters from Transcontinental's legal department alleging contractual violations of settlement agreements, despite never having settled with the airline. Sophia texted that she had been suddenly reassigned to international long-haul routes departing that evening, effectively removing her from communication for the next week. Most alarmingly, 3 key witnesses reported being approached by individuals, claiming to represent interested parties, willing to provide significant compensation for reconsideration of your statements regarding Transcontinental Airways. The company was systematically neutralizing their evidence through a combination of legal intimidation, operational maneuvers, and outright bribery attempts. Morgan's personal financial situation deteriorated further when she received notice that her bank accounts remained frozen pending extended fraud investigation. Her temporary accommodations had been paid through the weekend, but without access to funds, she would soon face housing insecurity, exactly as Transcontinental intended. Even her professional insurance provider, which normally covered legal defense for attorneys facing lawsuits, cited an obscure exclusion for matters arising from activities while on administrative leave from primary employer. Each financial pressure point increased the attractiveness of simply accepting whatever settlement Transcontinental might eventually offer. "They're trying to break you financially before we can even file our response," Xavier observed during an emergency strategy call. Classic corporate pressure tactic. The most devastating blow came when Xavier called Morgan from outside his office building late Friday night. "Someone broke in, targeted specifically to my files." His voice was tight with controlled anger. "They took our case files, client statements, everything related to Transcontinental. Building security cameras malfunctioned during the precise window of the break-in." The sophistication of the operation suggested resources far beyond normal corporate security. This required professional expertise and connections to disabled building security systems without triggering alarms. "Thankfully, I kept digital backups in separate secure locations," Xavier added. "But this shows they're willing to cross into criminal territory to shut us down." The escalation heightened safety concerns for everyone involved. If they would break into a law office, what other lines might they cross? Saturday morning brought Transcontinental's media offensive into full swing. James Whitfield held a press conference positioned as a diversity commitment announcement, which served as a thinly veiled platform to undermine Morgan, without naming her directly. "While we respect everyone's right to express concerns, we cannot allow false narratives to distract from our industry-leading inclusion initiatives," he stated smoothly. Behind him stood a carefully arranged group of Transcontinental employees, prominently featuring minorities in the front row. The cynical display of tokenism was followed by the announcement of a new passenger experience enhancement program, effectively rebranding the very verification protocols that had targeted minority passengers. Most disturbingly, standing at Whitfield's right hand was Richard Ellis, identified as both Morgan's former employer and a transportation industry legal expert. Richard's presence confirmed the coordinated nature of the attack. Taking the microphone, he delivered the most personal blow yet. "As someone who mentored Ms. Wright for 7 years, I'm deeply disappointed by her choice to fabricate discrimination claims when faced with standard security protocols. Ellis & Montgomery has always championed diversity, which makes these false allegations particularly hurtful to our firm family." The calculated betrayal, broadcast on national news, was designed to devastate both professionally and personally. By positioning himself as a disappointed mentor rather than an adversary, Richard aimed to make Morgan appear ungrateful and unreliable even to potential supporters. The press conference concluded with the announcement that Transcontinental had established a passenger relations improvement fund, undoubtedly their settlement mechanism for discrimination cases, exactly as Morgan's evidence had suggested. That afternoon, Morgan received an email from Ellis & Montgomery's Human Resources Department. The message was brief. "In light of recent events, the firm is offering a separation agreement including 6 months' salary and neutral references in exchange for full confidentiality regarding all matters related to Transcontinental Airways, Westlake Industries, and Ellis & Montgomery. This offer expires in 48 hours. The settlement amount would solve her immediate financial crisis, but permanently silence her regarding everything she had uncovered." Similar offers arrived almost simultaneously to several coalition members, clearly coordinated to fragment their unity at a vulnerable moment. Xavier reported that half of their witnesses had suddenly gone silent, presumably accepting similar arrangements. "They're picking us off one by one," he admitted during a secure call. People have bills, families, careers. Not everyone can withstand this kind of pressure. The pressure extended beyond financial and professional realms into Morgan's personal safety. Her mother called in tears after receiving photographs in the mail showing Elaine entering her doctor's office, shopping at her local grocery store, and checking her mail, all taken by someone conducting surveillance. The implicit threat was clear. Detective Jackson, who had been helpful throughout the ordeal, called with troubling news. "I've been reassigned effective immediately. Captain says it's departmental restructuring, but the timing isn't coincidental." His voice carried the frustration of someone whose hands were suddenly tied. "Someone made calls from very high up. I'm being shipped to cold cases in the records basement." Before ending the call, he added quietly, "Be careful, Miss Wright. The connections here go deeper than I initially thought. My replacement has close ties to airline security contractors." The systematic removal of allies continued as corporate influence reached even into law enforcement, closing yet another avenue of support just as Morgan needed it most. Sunday evening, with the legal response deadline approaching the next morning, Xavier called an emergency meeting of the remaining coalition members. Attendance had dwindled by nearly half, reflecting the effectiveness of Transcontinental's divide-and-conquer strategy. Those who remained showed the strain of the past week, exhaustion, fear, and uncertainty visible on every face. "They're counting on us to fracture under pressure," Xavier reminded the group. "But we still have the truth on our side, and enough evidence to proceed despite their tactics." Morgan surveyed the determined faces of those who had resisted settlement, offers, and intimidation. The coalition might be smaller, but those who remained were fully committed to seeing this through, regardless of the personal cost. As the meeting concluded, Benjamin pulled Morgan and Xavier aside. "I've been monitoring their digital activities, and something big is happening," the cybersecurity expert reported. "Massive internal communications at Transcontinental Ellis and Montgomery and Westlake Industries in the past 3 hours. Something spooked them." He showed them data visualizations of email and message traffic within the 3 companies, all showing unprecedented spikes. "They're in crisis mode, but I can't tell why yet." The unexpected development provided a glimmer of hope. Had their opponents made a mistake? Was there internal dissent? Whatever the cause, the timing suggested they should proceed with their planned legal response rather than delay. Something had created vulnerability in the seemingly unified corporate front. Monday morning, Xavier filed their comprehensive response to Transcontinental's lawsuit, accompanied by a separate class action suit representing 34 passengers who had experienced similar discrimination. Despite the break-in, they had managed to assemble compelling evidence including Sophia's video footage, internal training documents, statistical analyses showing racial disparities in verification protocols, and testimony from multiple employees. Most powerfully, they included Trevor Richardson's recorded racist comments about keeping certain passengers out of first class. The filing received immediate media attention, temporarily shifting the narrative back in their favor. Legal analysts described the evidence as potentially devastating to Transcontinental's defense and questioned the airline's decision to pursue litigation given the damaging materials now entered into public record. By Monday afternoon, the reason for the previous day's corporate communications spike became clear. A financial analyst blog published a detailed expose revealing that James Whitfield, Transcontinental's CEO, had secretly sold $12 million in company stock just before Morgan's incident went viral, suggesting he anticipated negative impact on share value. The timing of the sales raised serious questions about whether the aggressive response to Morgan had been partly motivated by the need to protect Whitfield from insider trading accusations. If he had known about discriminatory practices that could damage the company's value and sold stock before they became public, he could face SEC violations. This new angle transformed the story from a discrimination case to a potential corporate governance scandal, attracting entirely new categories of scrutiny from financial regulators and business press. The stock trading revelation created the first major crack in the unified corporate response. By Tuesday morning, Transcontinental's board of directors announced an emergency session, and rumors of internal conflict over handling of the situation began leaking to business publications. A financial news channel reported that several major institutional investors had expressed grave concerns about leadership decisions and potential liability exposure. Transcontinental's stock price dropped 11% in a single day, creating shareholder pressure that no amount of media management could easily contain. The coordinated attack on Morgan and her allies had been predicated on maintaining absolute control of the narrative, a control that was now slipping as new players with different priorities entered the field. Taking advantage of the momentary disarray, Xavier arranged for Morgan to give her first full-length television interview with a respected news program known for in-depth investigative reporting. Carefully prepared and supported by coalition members, Morgan presented a compelling narrative backed by substantial evidence. Rather than focusing solely on her personal experience, she methodically outlined the systematic nature of discrimination at Transcontinental, the coordinated effort to silence her, and the broader implications for corporate accountability. "This isn't about one flight or one flight attendant," she explained calmly. "It's about powerful entities believing they can discriminate with impunity, then destroy anyone who challenges them." Her poised, substantive responses contrasted sharply with Transcontinental's increasingly defensive statements, shifting public perception decisively. The interview's impact exceeded even Xavier's optimistic projections. By Wednesday morning, 3 former Ellis and Montgomery attorneys had reached out offering to provide sworn statements about the firm's unethical handling of previous discrimination cases against Transcontinental. A senior partner from a competing firm publicly questioned Richard Ellis's characterization of events, noting that Morgan's reputation for integrity was unimpeachable within legal circles. Most significantly, 2 members of Transcontinental's board contacted Xavier through intermediaries, expressing interest in exploring resolution options that address systemic issues, corporate speak for seeking settlement before further damage occurred. The unified front was crumbling as self-interest led various players to begin protecting their individual positions. The most dramatic development came Thursday morning, when Morgan received a call from Vanessa Chen. "Turn on Business News now," the journalist instructed without preamble. Breaking news banners announced that Transcontinental Airways shareholders had filed an emergency motion to remove James Whitfield as CEO, citing catastrophic leadership failures and material misrepresentations to the board regarding discrimination policies. Simultaneously, the SEC announced a formal investigation into the timing of Whitfield's stock sales. The carefully constructed corporate counterattack had backfired spectacularly, focusing even more attention on the very practices Transcontinental had tried to conceal. Rather than silencing one passenger's complaint, their aggressive tactics had escalated the situation into a governance crisis, threatening the entire company's leadership structure. By Friday morning, exactly 1 week after Transcontinental filed their lawsuit against Morgan, Trevor Richardson was served with a subpoena for all communications regarding passenger verification protocols and the handling of Morgan's specific incident. Similar subpoenas went to Richard Ellis and other key executives involved in the coordinated response. Detective Jackson called from his basement reassignment to share a small victory. "Internal Affairs is reviewing why I was removed from your IADTR case after pressure from above. Things are shifting." Even the bank freezes on Morgan's accounts were suddenly resolved with a formal apology for the extended processing time. The momentum had definitively shifted, with the same corporate connections that had been weaponized against Morgan now creating vulnerability as executives sought to distance themselves from potentially illegal activities. As the corporate counterattack dissolved into internal finger-pointing and damage control, Morgan met with Xavier to discuss next steps. "They'll be offering settlement terms soon," he predicted. "Probably very generous financially with confidentiality requirements." Morgan nodded thoughtfully. "I'm not interested in just money. We have an opportunity to force real structural change." The discussion centered on how to leverage their suddenly strengthened position to secure not just personal compensation, but systematic reforms to protect future passengers. With each passing day, more evidence emerged, and more allies stepped forward, no longer afraid of retaliation from a company whose leadership was now fighting for survival. The question was no longer whether they could withstand the corporate counterattack, but how comprehensively they could transform the systems that had enabled discrimination in the first place. Despite the promising developments, Morgan's personal situation reached a crisis point in the days that followed. The temporary legal victories hadn't immediately translated to financial stability. Her savings, already depleted from weeks without income, dwindled to dangerous levels as legal costs mounted. Xavier had generously deferred his fees, but expert witnesses, court filings, and secure communications all required immediate payment. Morgan sold her designer handbags and watch, small sacrifices that bought precious time but couldn't sustain her indefinitely. The contrast was stark. Her case was gaining momentum while she personally faced potential financial ruin. Professional isolation deepened as former colleagues deliberately distanced themselves. Morgan's networking calls went unreturned. Emails to potential employers mysteriously disappeared. During a rare coffee meeting with a sympathetic former colleague, she learned that Ellis and Montgomery partners had been making discreet calls throughout the legal community, describing her as difficult and litigious, death sentences for an attorney seeking employment. 3 promising job interviews were abruptly canceled within hours of being scheduled. One hiring partner accidentally copied Morgan on an internal email that read simply, "Too much baggage right now. Maybe after the airline situation resolves." Her hard-earned professional reputation, built over years of exceptional work, had been poisoned through whisper networks. At Xavier's office, reviewing the latest filings, Morgan received an alarming call from the assisted living facility where her mother had temporarily relocated for safety. "Mrs. Wright experienced concerning chest pains this morning," the nurse explained. "She's been transported to Memorial Hospital as a precaution." Morgan rushed to the emergency room to find her mother connected to heart monitors, her normally vibrant presence diminished by institutional lighting and medical equipment. "It's just stress, baby," Elaine insisted weakly. "Don't you worry about me." But the cardiologist's assessment was more serious: stress-induced cardiomyopathy, sometimes called broken heart syndrome, triggered by the anxiety of recent weeks. The doctor spoke quietly, but firmly. She needs rest and minimal stress for recovery. The current situation isn't helping. The guilt crashed over Morgan in waves. Her pursuit of justice had endangered the person she loved most. Returning to Xavier's office the following day, Morgan found the atmosphere unexpectedly tense. Several coalition members had failed to appear for a scheduled strategy session. 2 more witnesses withdrew their statements this morning, Xavier explained grimly. "And I've lost contact with 3 others." The pressure campaign was intensifying, targeting their most vulnerable supporters. A passenger who had provided powerful testimony about similar discrimination received an anonymous dossier containing embarrassing personal information with a note: "This stays private if you stay silent." Support group members reported employment difficulties, suspicious vehicle break-ins, and random tax audits, all carrying the same message: opposing transcontinental carried consequences beyond legal proceedings. Morgan's resolve weakened. Further, when Xavier reluctantly shared concerning developments in their legal strategy. "The judge assigned to our case has troubling connections," he explained, showing Morgan research compiled by his team. He's spoken at 3 conferences sponsored by airline industry groups, and his brother-in-law sits on Transcontinental's Regional Advisory Board. While not rising to the level requiring recusal, these connections suggested potential bias. "We can file for reassignment, but it's rarely granted and often antagonizes the court." The judicial system, their primary avenue for justice, suddenly seemed less reliably neutral than Morgan's legal training had led her to believe. Benjamin arrived late to the strategy meeting, his normally composed demeanor visibly shaken. "They've compromised our secure communications," the cybersecurity expert announced. "Sophisticated infiltration probably began weeks ago. The implications were staggering. Their opponent had likely monitored strategy discussions, witness outreach, and legal planning in real time." "How is that possible?" Morgan asked, remembering the extensive precautions they had implemented. Benjamin's expression darkened. "This level of penetration suggests resources beyond corporate security. Government-grade capabilities deployed against private citizens." The coalition's technical safeguards, which had seemed so robust, had been insufficient against the extraordinary resources aligned against them. That evening, Alone in her increasingly sparse apartment, Morgan faced her darkest moment. Her mother was hospitalized, her finances nearly exhausted, her professional future uncertain, and even their legal strategy potentially compromised. The secure phone Xavier had provided rang with an unfamiliar number. "Ms. Wright, this is Howard Klein, Transcontinental Airways General Counsel." The voice was smooth, confident, the tone of someone who believed they held all the cards. "In the interest of resolving this unfortunate situation efficiently, I've been authorized to present a comprehensive settlement offer." The terms were superficially generous. Full financial compensation for her losses, immediate reinstatement of her professional standing, comprehensive health care for her mother, and a substantial cash payment. The catch came at the end: complete confidentiality, retraction of all public statements, and dissolution of the coalition. "This offer expires at midnight," Klein concluded. "Given your current circumstances, I strongly advise acceptance." Morgan's hand trembled as she ended the call. The offer would solve her immediate problems: her mother's medical care, her financial crisis, even her professional standing. All she needed to do was abandon the fight and allow Transcontinental to continue its discriminatory practices unchallenged. How many more passengers would face similar treatment if she accepted? Yet how could she continue fighting when each day brought her closer to complete personal collapse? The coalition was fracturing, their communications compromised, their legal position uncertain. Perhaps accepting the settlement was the rational choice when fighting against such overwhelming power. As midnight approached, Morgan stared at her phone. Klein's contact information displayed on the screen, her finger hovering over the call button. The moment of decision had arrived. Morgan awoke the next morning to insistent knocking at her apartment door. She had ultimately decided not to call Klein back, choosing instead to consult with Xavier before making any decision about the settlement offer. Opening the door cautiously, she found a courier holding a large manila envelope. "Delivery for Morgan Wright," he announced, handing her a signature pad. The unmarked package contained a USB drive and a handwritten note. "I worked in TA's legal department for 15 years. What they're doing is wrong. This is everything. Be careful who sees this. J." Morgan immediately called Xavier, who advised, bringing the drive directly to his office without connecting it to any personal devices. Benjamin conducted extensive security checks before determining the drive was free from malware or tracking software. The contents proved explosive: thousands of internal Transcontinental Airways documents spanning nearly a decade. Email exchanges between executives described explicit strategies to maintain passenger quality standards in premium cabins by discouraging demographic outliers. Financial records revealed a dedicated fund for quietly settling discrimination claims, categorized as passenger relations management. Most damning were detailed reports analyzing the passenger verification system that had flagged Morgan, showing it disproportionately targeted minorities for enhanced scrutiny by design, not by accident. "This is corporate discrimination with receipts," Xavier whispered as they scrolled through document after document. Among the files was evidence directly linking Transcontinental's practices to biased facial recognition technology. The airline had invested heavily in a system known to have significantly higher error rates when identifying minorities, despite internal testing confirming these flaws. Emails showed executives dismissing these concerns. The occasional false positive is acceptable given the overall passenger composition goals for premium cabins. Another executive had responded, "Agreed. First class has a certain aesthetic that passengers expect and are willing to pay extra for." The casual racism of these exchanges, preserved in corporate communications, revealed discrimination as deliberate strategy rather than unfortunate oversight. The whistleblower's files also identified Diane Reynolds, a senior compliance officer who had repeatedly raised concerns about the legality of these practices. According to internal HR documents, she had been abruptly terminated 6 months earlier for performance issues immediately following a particularly forceful memo warning about potential discrimination liability. Xavier immediately dispatched an investigator to locate Reynolds, believing her testimony could prove crucial if they could reach her before Transcontinental did. Someone this principled would have kept personal records, he reasoned. And they fired her to silence her, which means she knows even more than what's in these files. While Xavier's team worked to contact Reynolds, Morgan focused on another disturbing revelation from the files: Heather Caldwell's background. The flight attendant who had confronted Morgan had a documented history of targeting minority passengers for verification incidents. More troublingly, social media records collected during her hiring showed connections to several organizations classified by civil rights groups as white supremacist adjacent. These affiliations had been flagged during her background check but dismissed by a supervisor as irrelevant to job performance. The airline had knowingly placed someone with explicitly biased views in a position of authority over passenger verification, then expressed surprise when discriminatory incidents occurred. The most shocking discovery came buried in a folder labeled Risk Management, Special Situations. It contained audio recordings of a planning meeting held 2 days before Morgan's flight. In the recording, Trevor Richardson could be heard discussing specific verification targets for the coming week's premium routes. Morgan's name was explicitly mentioned. Wright, Morgan, Platinum member, frequent first-class upgrade, filed complaint last month about entertainment system. Add to FRP list for Chicago route. Another voice asked about justification, to which Richardson responded, standard random selection. If questioned, reference security algorithms. The meeting continued, with executives discussing how to discourage certain passengers from premium cabins without creating actionable evidence of discrimination. Morgan listened in stunned silence as her ordeal was revealed to be not random misfortune, but targeted action. Deeper in the files, they discovered internal communications revealing the airline's explicit rationale for targeting minority passengers in first class. A presentation to regional managers titled Premium Cabin Experience Optimization contained survey data showing some passengers reported higher satisfaction when premium cabins maintained demographic consistency with historical patterns. Rather than challenging these biased preferences, Transcontinental had implemented systems to cater to them. One slide specifically noted, passengers paying premium prices expect an environment that matches their comfort parameters. Our verification protocols help maintain these expectations. The document effectively admitted using discrimination as a business strategy to satisfy the prejudices of some high-paying customers. The evidence extended beyond passenger treatment to hiring and promotion practices. Internal HR directives showed flight attendants were assigned to premium cabins based partly on appearance factors contributing to passenger comfort, a thinly veiled reference to racial preferences. Emails between James Whitfield and the VP of Customer Experience joked about passenger quality control when discussing the verification system's effectiveness. Most disturbingly, a legal department memo analyzed the financial benefits of occasional settlements versus the premium revenue generated by maintaining cabin composition standards, concluding that discrimination was profitable, even accounting for occasional payouts to those who complained persistently enough. The historical context of these practices proved particularly damning. A document titled Premium Service Evolution traced the airline's passenger verification procedures to policies originally developed in the 1960s during desegregation. Though the language had been modernized and technically discriminatory terms removed, the underlying purpose remained unchanged, controlling who had access to premium spaces based on demographic characteristics. The document even referenced legacy standards being maintained through contemporary methods, revealing how systemic discrimination had simply evolved more sophisticated disguises rather than being eliminated. This historical continuity transformed the narrative from isolated incidents to ongoing institutional racism. Among the final documents was perhaps the most damning evidence yet, a spreadsheet detailing Transcontinental's passenger relations resolution fund. This dedicated financial reserve, approved at the board level, existed specifically to settle discrimination claims when they couldn't be otherwise suppressed. The fund documentation explicitly categorized complaints by passenger, race, with different standard settlement ranges for different groups. The systematic nature of this approach proved discrimination wasn't an accident, but an anticipated cost of doing business. one the airline had carefully budgeted for. Morgan and Xavier exchanged looks of disbelief as they realized the extent of what they had uncovered. This wasn't just evidence of discrimination against one passenger. It was the blueprint for an entire system designed to exclude while avoiding legal consequences. Late that evening, as they organized the overwhelming evidence, Xavier received a call from his investigator. "I found Diane Reynolds," he reported. "She's willing to meet tomorrow morning. Says she has additional documentation we haven't seen yet." For the first time in weeks, genuine hope replaced Morgan's exhaustion. The whistleblower files alone might have been enough to turn the tide, but Reynolds' testimony could provide the human element needed to make the evidence truly compelling. As Morgan finally returned to her apartment that night, she felt the balance of power had shifted definitively. Transcontinental had built elaborate systems to hide their discrimination, but those very systems had created the paper trail that would ultimately expose them. Their own meticulous documentation of prejudice would become the evidence that brought them down. The meeting with Diane Reynolds transformed their strategy entirely. The former compliance officer arrived at Xavier's office with not only her own extensive records, but a detailed understanding of Transcontinental's vulnerabilities. "They've convinced themselves they're untouchable," she explained, sorting through her files. "That arrogance creates blind spots we can exploit." A poised woman in her 50s with 30 years of aviation industry experience, Reynolds had documented every discriminatory policy she encountered, preparing for exactly this moment. "I knew someone would eventually build a case strong enough to matter. I just didn't expect it would require someone of your professional caliber being victimized so publicly." Her validation of Morgan's experience carried special weight, coming from someone who had witnessed the system from the inside for years. With Reynolds' guidance, Xavier and Morgan developed a multi-channel approach to release their evidence for maximum impact. Rather than filing everything in court at once, where it could potentially be sealed through procedural maneuvers, they created a strategic distribution plan. Key documents were shared simultaneously with regulatory agencies, congressional oversight committees, and trusted journalists at various publications. "No single point of suppression," Xavier explained as they finalized preparations. "If they shut down one avenue, the evidence continues flowing through others." By the following morning, their carefully curated evidence packages had reached the Department of Transportation, Federal Aviation Administration, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and select congressional staff with oversight responsibilities. For transportation industries, the coordinated release created immediate ripples. By mid-afternoon, 3 major news organizations had published detailed exposés on Transcontinental's discriminatory systems, each highlighting different aspects of the evidence. Social media exploded with outrage as internal emails showing executives' casual racism circulated widely. Aviation industry publications raised serious questions about regulatory compliance, while business press focused on the financial implications of potential penalties and boycotts. Most significantly, civil rights organizations mobilized their considerable resources behind the case, transforming it from one passenger's experience to a landmark battle against corporate discrimination. The narrative had irrevocably shifted from Morgan versus Transcontinental to a systemic challenge of industry-wide practices. The evidence release coincided with Xavier filing amended legal documents formally establishing their class action lawsuit. The plaintiff list had grown to 63 individuals with documented discrimination experiences on transcontinental flights, creating a pattern too substantial to dismiss as isolated incidents. The filing included Reynolds' sworn affidavit, detailing how she had been terminated for raising discrimination concerns internally. Most powerfully, it contained the recording of transcontinental executives specifically targeting Morgan for verification after her customer service complaint. The judge, who had previously seemed potentially biased, now faced a case with public scrutiny too intense to allow procedural favoritism. Within hours, the court calendar was adjusted to accelerate hearing dates, a small but significant indication of changing dynamics. Morgan's public standing transformed virtually overnight. Media outlets that had previously questioned her credibility now sought exclusive interviews. Xavier carefully managed these requests, arranging for Morgan to appear on a respected Sunday morning news program with a reputation for substantive policy discussions. Unlike previous defensive interviews, Morgan now spoke from a position of documented evidence and growing public support. "This case has never been about just me," she explained calmly to millions of viewers. "It's about challenging systematic discrimination designed to make certain spaces unwelcoming to people who look like me, regardless of their credentials or accomplishments." Her poised articulation of the broader principles at stake resonated across political and demographic lines, generating support from unexpected quarters. The corporate alliance that had initially united against Morgan began fracturing under pressure. Former colleagues from Ellis and Montgomery contacted her privately, expressing dismay at the firm's handling of the situation. A junior partner secretly shared that internal dissent was growing as the firm's reputation suffered from association with discriminatory practices. "Several major clients have quietly asked if the firm has other problematic airline relationships," he reported. "The management committee is divided on how to proceed." Similar divisions emerged at Westlake Industries, where board members questioned the wisdom of maintaining close ties with an airline facing potential regulatory actions and consumer boycotts. The unified opposition was dissolving as individual entities prioritized self-preservation over collective defense of discriminatory systems. Most dramatically, Transcontinental Airways experienced internal revolt as the evidence became public. Flight attendants' union representatives demanded emergency meetings, uncomfortable with their members being implicated in discriminatory practices. An anonymous group identifying as concerned TA employees issued a public statement distancing themselves from leadership decisions and calling for accountability. Several mid-level executives resigned rather than be associated with the burgeoning scandal. The company's carefully constructed external image as a diversity-friendly employer collapsed under the weight of their own documented behaviors. Even shareholders began questioning leadership, with an activist investor group calling for executive replacement and governance reforms to address catastrophic moral and financial failures. Morgan's television interview catalyzed broader public engagement with the case. Hashtags related to first-class discrimination trended globally as passengers shared similar experiences across multiple airlines. Civil rights organizations reported overwhelming response to their support campaigns, with donations and volunteer offers flooding their systems. Congressional representatives from multiple states announced plans for hearings on algorithmic discrimination in transportation, citing the transcontinental documents as evidence of needed regulatory oversight. What had begun as one passenger's humiliation had evolved into a national conversation about hidden discrimination in supposedly meritocratic spaces. 9 days after the evidence release, Transcontinental Airways Board of Directors called an emergency session that lasted 14 hours. By morning, they announced James Whitfield had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation of policy oversight failures, with CFO Patricia Hernandez appointed interim CEO. The accompanying statement acknowledged serious concerns about passenger verification procedures and promised comprehensive review of all practices that may have enabled discriminatory outcomes. Though carefully worded to limit legal liability, the announcement represented their first substantive retreat from denying discrimination entirely. Within hours, Richard Ellis issued a similar statement, announcing his temporary step back from managing partner responsibilities while the firm examines its client relationship protocols. The architects of Morgan's professional destruction were experiencing parallel falls from grace. The cascade of accountability accelerated when congressional subpoenas were issued to Trevor Richardson and other key executives involved in developing and implementing the passenger verification systems. No longer protected by corporate damage control, these individuals faced personal legal exposure for their documented actions. Richardson's attorney contacted Xavier about potential cooperation in exchange for consideration, a remarkable reversal from his previous racist comments about Morgan. Similar approaches came from other executives suddenly eager to position themselves as reluctant participants rather than enthusiastic architects of discriminatory systems. The unified defense had completely collapsed, replaced by individual scrambles for self-preservation. By week's end, Morgan received an unexpected invitation. The newly appointed interim CEO requested a private meeting to discuss constructive resolution of outstanding issues and necessary structural reforms. Unlike previous settlement approaches, this invitation specifically mentioned addressing systemic factors, and included no preconditions regarding confidentiality. Xavier advised cautious engagement. They're finally serious about actual change, not just containing damage. The power dynamic had fundamentally shifted. Morgan was no longer a victim seeking redress, but a central figure whose involvement was necessary for the airline's rehabilitation. As she prepared for this pivotal meeting, Morgan reflected on how completely the tables had turned. The same corporation that had attempted to destroy her now needed her participation in their redemption narrative. The question was no longer whether she would achieve justice, but how comprehensively she could transform the systems that had enabled discrimination in the first place. 6 months later, Morgan stood at a podium in the grand ballroom of the Westfield Hotel, addressing the annual conference of the National Transportation Equity Alliance. Behind her, a banner proclaimed the conference theme, "Equal Access Across All Classes." The audience included aviation executives, regulatory officials, civil rights advocates, and legal professionals, many of whom had been directly involved in the landmark settlement agreement, now transforming industry practices. What began as a moment of humiliation became a movement for accountability, Morgan told the attentive crowd. Today, we're seeing the implementation of the most comprehensive anti-discrimination reforms in commercial aviation history. The journey from first-class passenger to keynote speaker at this prestigious event reflected how completely her personal ordeal had transformed into systemic change. The settlement agreement with Transcontinental Airways had shattered precedent, in both scope and substance. Rather than the typical financial payment and confidentiality requirements, Morgan and the coalition had secured structural reforms that reached every aspect of the airline's operations. The company committed to complete redesign of its passenger verification systems, with independent auditors monitoring algorithmic outcomes for demographic disparities. Training programs for flight crews now explicitly addressed unconscious bias and provided practical intervention strategies when discrimination occurred. Most significantly, the airline established the industry's first passenger equity office, with substantial authority to investigate complaints and recommend personnel actions, with Diane Reynolds appointed as its inaugural director. Financial compensation had been substantial but distinctively structured. Rather than accepting personal payments, Morgan had insisted that settlement funds establish the Air Travel Justice Foundation, providing legal assistance to passengers experiencing discrimination across all airlines. The foundation's first year had already supported 37 cases, creating mounting pressure on other carriers to proactively reform their own practices rather than face similar litigation. Additionally, Transcontinental had committed significant resources to minority scholarship programs supporting education in aviation, hospitality management, and transportation policy, expanding diversity in the industry's future leadership pipeline. Individual accountability had been equally unprecedented. Heather Caldwell faced criminal charges for falsifying medical records and making false statements to security personnel. Trevor Richardson and several other executives received substantial penalties from regulatory agencies for implementing discriminatory policies. Most significantly, James Whitfield remained under SEC investigation for potential securities violations related to his stock sales prior to the scandal becoming public. The carefully constructed executive immunity that had previously protected decision-makers from personal consequences had been decisively broken, creating powerful incentives for corporate leaders throughout the industry to examine their own practices. Ellis & Montgomery experienced its own reckoning in the settlement's aftermath. The firm's role in facilitating discrimination through legal assistance became a case study in ethics training at law schools nationwide. Richard Ellis resigned permanently after Bar Association investigations into conflict of interest violations. Multiple high-profile clients terminated their relationships with the firm, citing reputational concerns. From this decimated foundation, a reformed management committee implemented comprehensive ethical oversight processes and established one of the legal industry's most progressive diversity initiatives. The transformation wasn't merely cosmetic. Substantive policy changes reflected genuine commitment to preventing similar ethical failures in the future. Morgan's professional trajectory had taken an unexpected but fulfilling direction. Following the settlement, she received partnership offers from several prestigious firms, but ultimately chose to establish Right Justice Partners, specializing in corporate accountability and discrimination cases. With Xavier Thompson as her founding partner, the firm quickly developed a reputation for effectively challenging systemic discrimination across industries. Major corporations now proactively consulted them on policy reforms, preferring voluntary improvements to potential litigation. Morgan's team had grown to 15 attorneys dedicated to expanding the precedents established in the transcontinental case to other sectors where algorithmic bias and subtle discrimination persisted. Sophia's courage in providing crucial evidence had been recognized as well. Following the settlement, she received numerous job offers from airlines implementing new equity initiatives, ultimately accepting a position leading Transcontinental's completely redesigned crew training program on passenger respect and dignity. Her personal experience witnessing discrimination became a powerful teaching tool as she transformed flight crew culture from within. The other flight attendants who had eventually supported Morgan's case similarly found their careers advancing, rather than suffering, creating powerful examples that ethical behavior ultimately proved professionally beneficial despite short-term risks. Industry-wide impact extended far beyond Transcontinental. Within months of the settlement, every major U.S. airline announced comprehensive reviews of their passenger verification systems, seating policies, and crew training protocols. The Department of Transportation implemented new reporting requirements, specifically tracking demographic patterns in passenger complaints and resolution outcomes. Insurance companies began requiring documented anti-discrimination protocols before issuing liability coverage to carriers. The collective effect transformed aviation from an industry with minimal accountability for discrimination to one with multi-layered oversight and transparency requirements. Passengers of all backgrounds began reporting measurable improvements in equitable treatment across service classes. For Morgan personally, perhaps the most meaningful outcome was her mother's recovery and renewed pride. Elaine Wright, fully recovered from her stress-induced cardiac episode, beamed from the front row of the conference audience. The woman who had raised Morgan alone while facing her own battles with discrimination now watched her daughter lead transformative change at the national level. Their relationship had deepened through shared adversity, with Elaine's wisdom and resilience providing essential support during the darkest moments of Morgan's journey. The justice Morgan secured wasn't just for herself, but for generations of passengers who had silently endured similar treatment without recourse. The conference keynote represented Morgan's most comprehensive public reflections on the experience and its aftermath. "Systems designed to exclude require systems designed to correct," she told the audience. "Accountability isn't about punishment but transformation. We've created structures that make discrimination financially, legally, and reputationally unsustainable for corporations." Her words resonated with particular power, coming from someone who had experienced discrimination's impact firsthand, yet focused on systemic solutions rather than personal vindication. The standing ovation that followed reflected recognition of both her personal courage and the broader movement she now represented. As the conference concluded, Morgan received news of the final symbolic victory. Transcontinental Airways interim CEO, Patricia Hernandez, whose leadership had guided the company through its painful transformation, had been permanently appointed to the position, the first Black woman to lead a major U.S. airline. The appointment came with board approval of the comprehensive equity initiatives Hernandez had championed throughout the settlement implementation process. What had begun with Morgan being forcibly removed from first class had culminated in historic leadership diversity at the highest corporate level. The systemic changes now extended from passenger experience to executive decision-making, creating multi-layered transformation that would outlast any single case or settlement. 1 month later, Morgan boarded a Transcontinental Airways flight to Chicago, her first time flying the airline since the original incident. As she settled into her first-class seat, the lead flight attendant approached with a tablet. "Ms. Wright, the captain would like to personally welcome you aboard today." Rather than the verification challenge she had experienced previously, this interaction carried profoundly different meaning. The captain, an older Black woman, had emerged from the cockpit specifically to greet her. "What you did changed things, for all of us," the captain said quietly, gesturing subtly toward her uniform insignia. "Some battles need fighting so others don't have to, As the aircraft doors closed and preparation for departure began, Morgan noticed the diversity of passengers comfortably seated throughout first class, the visible evidence of systemic change. The airline that had once humiliated her now operated under transformed policies, leadership, and culture. The justice she had secured wasn't measured merely in settlement dollars, but in lasting structural reform that would benefit countless passengers long after her specific case faded from public memory. This powerful story illustrates several crucial lessons about confronting discrimination in modern society. First, systemic racism often hides behind seemingly neutral policies and algorithms that perpetuate exclusion while maintaining plausible deniability. Morgan's experience reveals how institutions use sophisticated methods to enforce discriminatory practices without explicit bias language. Second, fighting entrenched discrimination requires more than individual courage. It demands coalition building and strategic evidence gathering. Morgan succeeded not by fighting alone, but by forming alliances across racial, professional, and organizational boundaries, creating power through collective action that no single person could achieve. Third, corporations respond primarily to threats against their financial interests and reputation. Real change occurred not through moral appeals, but when discrimination became financially unsustainable through legal liability, consumer pressure, and shareholder concerns. This pragmatic reality highlights why economic consequences remain essential for achieving justice. Perhaps most importantly, the story demonstrates that true justice extends beyond individual compensation to systemic transformation. Morgan's victory wasn't measured in settlement dollars, but in structural reforms that would benefit countless future passengers. This reminds us that addressing discrimination requires changing systems, not just punishing individual actors. Finally, Morgan's journey shows that speaking truth against powerful interests carries real personal costs, yet remaining silent ultimately costs even more. The path to justice is rarely smooth, but persistent advocacy can transform individual suffering into lasting change that benefits society's most vulnerable members. Have you ever witnessed or experienced discrimination that was disguised as policy or procedure? Would you have had the courage to stand up like Morgan did when faced with such injustice? Comment below with your thoughts on how we can better recognize and challenge systemic discrimination in everyday situations. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives that expose the reality of modern discrimination. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how racism operates in supposedly post-racial environments. Together, we can build the awareness and solidarity needed to create more equitable systems. Thank you for watching, and remember, justice requires both courage and community.